My name's Nick Moon. I'm from GfK. This will be the last time I'm saying that as a public event because I'm stepping down to become a consultant in January, available for reporting, analysis, bar mitzvahs, weddings, funerals, so check it out in your diaries. But I'm particularly pleased to be chairing this Cathie Marsh seminar because Cathie was one of my very first clients all those years ago when I started out in research. I was lucky enough to work with Cathie on not just one, but two projects. A really interesting one on the influence of media on sentencing. To what extent did newspaper reports make people think sentences should be more or less harsh? And important and still very topical one on the influence of opinion polls on opinion. If you haven't actually read the paper that's produced, the gist of it is that if an opinion poll says X, then it has no effect at all. If an opinion poll says that trends in public opinion are moving towards X, that makes people more in favour of X. So, and I think that hasn't been repeated, but I suspect it's probably still true. Cathie, of course, was an important figure in social research in the UK, a great contributor to the field in her writing and the research that she conducted. So I'm very pleased that the seminar series in her name continues to honour her. It was originally designed, I'm sure some of you were there at the very first one, that finally settled the question of random versus quota sampling, or maybe didn't quite settle it. The seminar was originally designed as a debate between random and quota sampling, and it's kind of changed in different ways along the years. Sometimes it's been a debate, and sometimes it's just been a sort of presentation of views and opinion. Tonight's seminar, I think, has the potential to be potentially more of a bun fight than a debate. So I think it's important that we do have a few rules about it. I think we can take it as a given that each side was economical with the actuality at various times during the campaign, and we're not here to talk about whether Turkey really is joining the EU or whether there really would be an emergency budget after a no vote. We're here to talk about statistics, and we're particularly lucky to do the talking exactly those kind of people so despised by Michael Gove, experts. They're experts in the field, and they're experts in statistics, not necessarily as statisticians, but in the choice of statistics for presentational purposes, how to use them, how to evaluate them. And I think this is a fantastic example of just statistics really being used in the everyday world. And even if, as some say, first the referendum and now the US election show that we are in a world of post-truth politics, that doesn't mean we should lose sense of any sight of what the truth is, and especially statistical truths, and how they actually played out in the campaign. And we've got some really key players from the campaign, those running the campaigns, those reporting on them, who are going to talk to you tonight about statistics in the campaign. I'm really pleased that people with such a wide spectrum agreed to take part. So we're going to start with Suzanne Hall from Ipsos MORI, who's going to talk about what the public knows about statistics, in particular the kind of statistics that were being discussed in the referendum. And without stealing her paper too much, you won't be surprised to hear the broad answer is not very much. But she's going to talk about more detail than that, clearly. And then we'll hear from the leading players from each campaign, from Matthew Elliott from the Leave side and James McCrory from the Remain side, and it's really good of them to come and, after all that's been put to bed, to come and relive it for us. And then after the campaigners, two people who are in different ways trying to adjudicate on the campaign. So Full Fact, represented by Will Moy, they had a clear role, and they were sort of there to defend statistics, if you like. They were to defend the truth of statistics, and he'll talk about how they subjected the different claims to scrutiny. And then the BBC had a slightly more sort of nuanced role. They had to report what those sides were saying, but also they had to do it within their requirements to be impartial and fair during any kind of election. David Jordan will talk about how they managed to pull off that balance. To stop any fights developing until the very end, I'm going to keep all questions till the very end. I think we'll just get bogged down. If we start questions on the first speaker, we'll just get completely bogged down. So we're going to go from one to the other. There will be a small break whilst people get re-mic'd up. And then Jill Matheson is going to give us a summary. Now, who better to give a summary on something like this than a former national statistician? And she's going to give us a brief summary of what her take is on the whole thing. And then I will hand it over to all of you.
Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. As a qualitative researcher, it's an absolute honour to be here at the RSS, an unusual honour as well, and probably I am no expert in stats, I can say that, but I am going to talk about how people use statistics in the referendum campaign and what the public understood by them as well. I'm also going to have a look at some of the common misperceptions around the statistics that were floating around in the campaign, and also wrap up by looking at where are we now, how the public mood has changed since the time of the referendum, and where we've all ended up. First thing I want you to do is cast your mind back to the very start of 2016. For me, that feels like an absolute lifetime ago. So much has happened since, but if you can think back to when the clock ticked over into January 2016, we'll have a look at where people were. I think the first thing to look at is patriotic nostalgia was so common. It wasn't just common to the UK, it was common all over the world. And over half of people in Great Britain at the turn of the year thought that things would be better the way that they used to be. Now, we weren't as strong in that sentiment as some of our European neighbours, or even our American friends. 7 in 10 agreed that things would be better the way that they used to be, something that they voted for last week so they could make America great again. But it's amazing, just at the start of the year, how many people were looking backwards for their inspiration rather than forwards. So we were thinking about the past, but what we absolutely weren't thinking about as we came into 2016 was the EU itself. With a referendum on our membership just 6 short months away, only 5% at the turn of the year said that the EU was an issue of importance facing the country. So it really wasn't on our radar. It just wasn't something that we were interested in at that point or picking up on. And it's perhaps because we weren't thinking about the referendum that explains why we knew so very, very little around it. In one of our surveys in the run-up to the referendum, we asked people to see if they could identify true or false EU regulations and recommendations. Things like Bombay mix having to be renamed as Mumbai mix, barmaids not being allowed to show certain amounts of cleavage, sausages having to be renamed as emulsified high-fat offal tubes, and the rest. And on the whole, people were pretty good at identifying some of the clearly outrageous falsified recommendations, but it still stands that 1 in 7 people in the public believed one of these 7 Euro myths. So 1 in 7 people believed at least one of those Euro myths. The other thing we asked them to do is to say whether MEPs are directly elected by citizens in each member state or not. To check you're all awake, probably time for a little bit of audience participation. I'd like you to shout out, what percentage of the public do you think do not believe that MEPs are directly elected? Anyone? Whoever said 18, you must work with us. It is. It's 18% do not believe that MEPs are directly elected. And compounding that, a further 25% don't know either way. So in an EU campaign, in a referendum campaign where sovereignty was such an important issue that nearly half the population thought that MEPs were either parachuted into their jobs or they didn't know either way, I think is really striking. That's not the only Euro myth that was abounding at the time of the course of the EU referendum campaign. We also massively underestimated EU investment into the UK. Now, back in 2014, international investment into the UK tipped over the trillion figure for the first time ever, and the EU was responsible for about half of that figure. But we asked the public how much it amounted for, and they said just 30%. Instead, what they were doing is massively overestimating the proportion that China contributes to our economy. They thought it was 1/5 of that trillion figure. It's really just 1%. And in what's our least surprising survey figure ever, we also overestimated the number of EU immigrants into the country. I was surprised as well. We asked, out of every 100 residents in the UK, how many do you think were born in EU member states other than the UK? And the average guess is 15 in every 100. And among those who intended to vote leave, well, that figure rose to 20. So they thought that 1/5 of the UK population was an EU immigrant. The actual figure, just 5 in every 100. Now, there's a reason for these misperceptions, and there's a reason why we do surveys into these misperceptions as well, and it's not so we can sort of raise a wry smile at the things that the public get wrong. It's not about that at all. In fact, these misperceptions are a direct indicator of the things that concern us most, and it's a two-way street as well. We overestimate what we worry about, and we also then just worry about what we overestimate. What we're doing in answering surveys in this way is sending an indicator. It's called emotional innumeracy. So the Remain camp in this context was always going to struggle to get its message across, given that we overestimated immigration, but we underestimated the contribution that the EU was making to the economy. The other thing as well is that we remember colourful stories, vivid stories around bendy bananas, around Bombay mix. They're much more likely to stick in the brain than facts and figures about trade and investment, which are more dry. And it's not a criticism and it's not a media effect either. It's just how our brains are wired to work. But again, and as I'm sure we'll come on and talk about, it does mean that there's a limit to what myth-busting can do when emotion is kind of clearly the governing feature of a campaign and how people are making their decisions. And as Daniel Kahneman, author of Thinking Fast and Slow and the father of behavioural economics, said, the major impression one gets observing the debate is that the reasons for exit are clearly emotional. And this played into how people took on board the different messages that both sides on the campaign were putting forward. We presented respondents with a series of scenarios that could happen in the event of both a vote to remain and a vote to leave. One of the ones we tested was Turkey being fast-tracked into the EU and their population of 75 million having the right to free movement in the event of a vote to remain. Now, nearly half of the voting public thought that that was true. Only slightly fewer, 2 in 5, thought that it was false. And you can see that the public were completely polarised on the issue of whether Britain would be made to pay billions of pounds in bailouts for Eurozone countries in the event of a vote to remain. 45% thought it was true. The same proportion thought that it was false. But the risks associated with a vote to leave were much more likely to be discounted. You can see from this chart that in the event that Britain votes to leave, people were much clearer about what would and wouldn't happen. Only a third thought that the peace and stability of our continent would be put at risk. Fewer still, a fifth, believed that the stability of Northern Ireland would be put at risk. And least of all, it's the economic arguments that just weren't cutting through to the public. Only 17% thought that UK households will be made poorer and will lose £4,300 each year. 70% thought that was false. So you can see how these arguments are resonating with the public, and they were really cutting through, and those were the statistics that they were choosing to believe. This also ties in with the fact that Leave supporters were much less interested in the economy generally. In the run-up to the referendum, we asked people to tell us what was the most important feature for them in casting their votes. And for people who wanted to vote Remain, well, it was the economy all round, mentioned by around half of those who intended to vote Remain. But on the other hand, for those that wanted to vote for Leave, it was immigration, mentioned by 54%. And this matters because the economic argument was far, far from won. We asked people, if there was a vote to leave, how do you think it would affect you personally? What would the difference on your standard of living be? And around half felt it would make absolutely no difference whatsoever, whereas 1 in 5 thought actually things would get even better for them. So these economic arguments were far from won, and it meant that then tied into how people were making their decisions on the vote to leave or to remain. Of course, in the campaign, it's not just the statistics that we were receiving, it's where we were getting these information from and who was telling us about the statistics and what was going on in the campaign that mattered. Now, in the run-up, we clearly gave British businesses a license to speak. We wanted them to come out and say one way or the other which side they were backing. So 3/4 of us wanted SMEs to come out and speak, and 7 in 10 wanted big British businesses which trade internationally and big British businesses which only trade in the UK to come out and publicly back one side or the other. It also seems that the kind of death of experts is overstated. 7 in 10 of us wanted to hear from academics. And by and large, these people did come out. Businesses certainly did, and on the whole, they came out on the side of Remain. The thing we didn't quite follow through on is that only 3 in 10 of us trust businesses to tell the truth. So we wanted to hear from them, and then it was like, no, I don't believe you. Instead, our circle of influence was much closer to home. The people we trusted on issues relating to the EU were our friends and our families. It's also small business owners. It's the people we see every day. They're the people that we trust. But I think the other thing to take note of is that trust doesn't necessarily equate to impact either. The people that we heard most from in the campaign are the people we don't trust at all. It's journalists, 16%, and politicians generally, just trusted by 1 in 10. And they're always kind of chuntering along the bottom of these kind of trust index charts. But even though we don't trust them, we're exposed to them and what they have to say. So I thought I would wrap up on seeing where the public mood is now. We did a lot of talking about how we got here, how we got to the vote, and what the public are thinking, but I just thought it might be interesting to conclude on what's changed since the actual vote. I think the first thing that's really important to say is that none of our surveys since the referendum has there been any sign of regret or any other kind of portmanteau that we want to call regret about leaving the European Union. But what is low is confidence. Confidence in our political leaders to get the best possible deal for the UK, best possible exit terms. Only 3 in 5 have confidence in our political leaders to be able to do this. And of course, when you look at those who voted Remain, that confidence is dissipated further still. And it's perhaps not surprising, given that we saw on the previous chart how little we trust our politicians, how little we believe in the political class, that this confidence is so low. The other thing to look at is that concern about the EU has really spiked. We weren't thinking about the EU at the start of the year or in the run-up to the referendum, but since the vote, it's gone right up. 4 in 10 think it's an important issue facing Britain today. And at the same time, economic optimism has fallen. Now, our economic optimism index is the percentage of people who say that the economy is going to get better, minus those who say it's going to get worse. So while it may not have been an issue that we were casting our votes on in the time since the referendum, it's gone down to minus 34 as people start to consider what the implications are. And I think it will be interesting as we move into 2017 and get closer to the triggering of Article 50 to see what happens to public opinion on these key issues. Thank you very much.